August 15, 1945, Camp Mexia, Texas. The war had ended 6 hours ago, but inside the barbed wire perimeter, time moved differently. Japanese prisoners of war sat in their barracks, processing surrender with the silence of men whose certainty had been shattered not by bullets but by 4 years of cognitive dissonance. Among them, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, former military band conductor from Osaka, held his hands as if still gripping a baton he no longer possessed. Through the window he could hear something impossible. Swing music, complex and wild, pouring from the base auditorium where American soldiers gathered for Saturday entertainment. But this was not what fractured his understanding. What destroyed every assumption he had carried across the Pacific was the realization, confirmed by whispers among prisoners who worked the base, that the band leaders, the architects of this sophisticated, thunderous jazz, were women, not auxiliary performers, not singers standing pretty while men played, women conducting, women arranging, women commanding respect from thousands of soldiers who listened as if hearing democracy itself translated into rhythm. The sound reached through the wire like a question his empire had never taught him to answer. They had been told many things before embarkation. The Americans were soft, their women decorative and weak, their culture a shallow mimicry of European refinement without discipline or depth. Japanese military propaganda had painted the United States as a nation feminized by comfort, crippled by individualism, incapable of the collective sacrifice that defined true civilization. Yamamoto had believed this with the certainty of education, reinforced by every briefing, every officer's speech, every cultural assumption embedded in his training at the Tokyo Conservatory. He had studied Western classical music, of course, Beethoven, Wagner, Brahms, the titans of a Europe that Japan sought to equal. But American music? That was considered mongrel entertainment, corrupted by African influences, diluted by commercial vulgarity, performed by people his instructors dismissed as lacking proper aesthetic discipline. The prisoners at Camp Mexia had arrived in waves throughout 1943 and 1944, captured in Pacific Island battles that rewrote Japanese strategic calculations with each successive defeat. They came expecting brutality, having been instructed that surrender meant torture and death. Instead, they found bureaucracy, medical care, adequate food, and the bewildering efficiency of a nation that could simultaneously wage global war and maintain prisoner welfare standards outlined in Geneva Conventions most had never heard of. The cognitive dissonance began immediately. Guards were neither cruel nor particularly interested in domination. The base operated with casual competence that suggested unlimited resources. Trucks arrived daily with supplies. Electricity never failed. The machinery of American logistics hummed with the boring reliability of a system that had solved problems Japanese commanders still struggled with in the field. But nothing prepared them for the women. At first, the prisoners only heard rumors from work details. Female officers, female mechanics, female administrators. The Women's Army Corps operated openly, uniformly, with authority that seemed unremarkable to Americans but incomprehensible to men raised in rigid patriarchy. Then came reports of something more disorienting. Women musicians not performing auxiliary roles but leading entire orchestras, playing instruments Japanese military bands reserved exclusively for men, conducting arrangements of complexity that required years of serious study. Yamamoto listened to these accounts with the polite skepticism of someone hearing impossible things. Women could sing, certainly, perhaps play piano in domestic settings, but lead trumpet sections, arrange for full big bands, command the respect of professional male musicians and audiences of thousands? His entire musical education insisted this was propaganda or exaggeration. The sound drifting through the August heat suggested otherwise. The first time Yamamoto heard Ina Ray Hutton's arrangements filtering from the base auditorium, he assumed he was listening to a male band leader whose name he didn't recognize. The brass section attacked with precision that spoke of rigorous discipline. The saxophones wove counterpoint that required sophisticated harmonic understanding. The rhythm section drove with the mechanical perfection Japanese military bands spent years trying to achieve. This was not amateur entertainment. This was professional musicianship operating at a level that commanded respect in any cultural context. When a prisoner working the auditorium returned and mentioned casually that the bandleader was a woman, had been leading successful orchestras since the 1930s, had recorded extensively, commanded fees comparable to male bandleaders, and was treated by the military audience with the same respect they afforded any accomplished artist, Yamamoto felt something crack in his understanding. He began paying attention differently. The music continued every weekend, sometimes multiple times weekly when different units cycled through for entertainment. Other names emerged from prisoner conversations. Phil Spitalny's all-girl orchestra, performing for war bond rallies. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm, an integrated band that played military bases across the segregated South. Rita Rio, Ivy Benson in Britain, Ada Leonard. Not novelties, not auxiliary performers filling gaps left by men at war. These were established professionals, some of whom had been leading orchestras since the Depression, whose technical capability and commercial success predated the war entirely. The prisoners' initial response was dismissal rooted in certainty. Some laughed, assuming the accounts were distorted or the music they heard was actually being played by men, while women took superficial credit. Others suggested these were propaganda performances, staged to deceive prisoners about American cultural degeneracy. But Yamamoto, trained in music's technical language, could not dismiss what his ears confirmed. The arrangements were too sophisticated, the performances too consistent, the audience response too genuine. American soldiers, thousands of them, listened to these women with the appreciation of people hearing authentic artistry, not tolerating wartime substitutes. They applauded, they danced, they returned week after week. The respect was real, the skill undeniable, and every performance that reached through the wire fence carried the same implicit message. Everything he had been taught about gender, capability, and civilization was fundamentally wrong. The cognitive dissonance was not about music. It was about reality itself. September brought a shift in camp administration. With the war concluded, prisoners began limited supervised movement, allowed to attend base events as part of a calculated re-education program. Yamamoto found himself part of a group invited to a Sunday afternoon concert, not hidden in barracks, listening through windows but seated in the auditorium itself, surrounded by American soldiers whose war against Japan had ended 2 weeks prior. The atmosphere was not hostile. It was indifferent in a way that proved more devastating than hatred. These men did not see the prisoners as worthy enemies requiring constant vigilance. They saw them as defeated soldiers whose threat had passed, now meriting the basic courtesy extended to any prisoner under Geneva protections. The casual dismissal of Japanese martial culture as a serious ongoing concern struck harder than any propaganda speech could have. The band leader that afternoon was Ada Leonard, whose ensemble the military had contracted for a month-long tour of Southwest bases. Yamamoto watched her take the stage with the professional efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. No apology in her posture, no deference to the masculine space she occupied. She addressed the audience briefly, announced the program, raised her baton with the authoritative gesture of complete confidence, and brought the orchestra in with precision that would have impressed his instructors at the conservatory. The performance that followed destroyed the last refuge of his skepticism. This was not simplified music arranged to disguise technical limitations. Leonard had programmed a mix of swing standards and contemporary compositions that required serious capability. Duke Ellington's Concerto for Cootie, with its demands on the trumpet soloist, an arrangement of Gershwin that moved between jazz and classical vocabulary, a bebop-influenced original that pushed harmonic boundaries beyond what most military bands attempted. Her ensemble handled all of it with the casual competence of seasoned professionals. The trumpet section hit high notes with brass clarity. The saxophone soloist improvised with the harmonic sophistication of someone deeply versed in jazz theory. The rhythm section maintained groove that made soldiers tap their feet unconsciously, that made the music feel inevitable and necessary. But more than the technical execution, Yamamoto observed the social dynamic. Male musicians followed Leonard's direction without hesitation. Soldiers in the audience listened with genuine appreciation, not performative tolerance. The respect was authentic, earned through skill that transcended the gender assumptions he had carried his entire life. When the concert ended, soldiers applauded with enthusiasm that spoke of people who had heard something valuable, not people dutifully acknowledging a wartime novelty. In the weeks that followed, Yamamoto began asking questions that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Other prisoners, those who spoke better English or worked in closer proximity to American personnel, became sources of information about this phenomenon that contradicted everything imperial education had taught. The answers assembled into a picture more disorienting than simple wartime necessity. These women band leaders had not emerged because men were unavailable. Many had been leading successful orchestras throughout the 1930s during peacetime, competing in a professional market that included male band leaders with established reputations. Ina Ray Hutton had been famous since 1934. Phil Spitalny's all-girl orchestra had performed on national radio for years. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm had toured continuously, playing venues that demanded serious musical capability. The war had expanded their opportunities, certainly. Military bases needed entertainment. War bond rallies required performances. And the sheer scale of mobilization created demand that exceeded supply. But these women were not filling vacancies. They were continuing careers, expanding audiences, earning professional fees and receiving respect commensurate with their abilities. American culture, for all its contradictions and limitations, had created economic space for women to pursue artistic careers at levels Japanese society reserved exclusively for men. The mechanism was not ideological enlightenment. Yamamoto learned that American women faced substantial discrimination, that social expectations remained restrictive, that many professions remained effectively closed, but commercial entertainment operated by different rules. If you could sell tickets, if audiences paid to hear you perform, if you could deliver professional quality artistry that met market standards, your gender became secondary to your economic value. This market logic mystified prisoners raised in a culture where social hierarchy determined opportunity, regardless of individual capability. The idea that commercial success could override traditional gender roles, that economic efficiency might challenge cultural assumptions, that individual talent could earn space within collective systems, these concepts existed outside the framework of imperial Japanese thought. Yet here was the evidence. Women leading orchestras, commanding respect, earning professional wages, traveling freely, exercising artistic authority, and doing so not as revolutionary activists, but as working professionals operating within capitalist systems that valued capability over conformity to rigid social categories. The cognitive framework required to process this reality did not exist in Yamamoto's education. He had no vocabulary for a society that could be simultaneously patriarchal and pragmatic, restrictive and opportunistic, traditional and flexible. The contradiction itself revealed how much he did not understand about the nation that had defeated his empire. A prisoner named Sato, who worked in the base library, began bringing back magazines and newspapers that documented this phenomenon beyond the immediate performances they witnessed. Downbeat magazine, the professional journal of jazz musicians, featured regular coverage of women band leaders reviewed with the same critical standards applied to male artists. Trade publications discussed booking challenges, venue contracts, recording sessions. The coverage was not celebratory propaganda but routine professional journalism that treated these women as working musicians worthy of serious criticism and analysis. When Ada Leonard received a negative review for an off-night performance in Dallas, the critique focused on technical issues, tempo choices, arrangement weaknesses, soloist errors, not on her gender. The assumption embedded in the criticism was that she was capable of better work, that she should be held to professional standards, that her gender was irrelevant to evaluation of artistic quality. Yamamoto studied these materials with the intensity of someone reconstructing a worldview from fragments. He learned that the International Sweethearts of Rhythm was racially integrated, touring the segregated South with a roster that included Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, and indigenous musicians. This fact alone would have been impossible in Japan, where racial hierarchy was enforced with ideological rigidity. Yet here was an American ensemble functioning successfully, despite existing in a society that also practiced racial segregation, playing venues that served segregated audiences, navigating contradictions that Americans seemed to accept without perceiving the philosophical incoherence. The band's existence suggested that American culture operated on multiple contradictory principles simultaneously: racial segregation and racial integration, gender restriction and gender opportunity, ideological conservatism, and pragmatic flexibility. The system was not coherent. It was adaptive, responding to economic incentives and individual capability in ways that created cracks in official social hierarchies. British prisoner newsletters, shared among the various POW camps, mentioned similar phenomena in the United Kingdom. Ivy Benson's orchestra, formed in 1940, touring extensively throughout the war, playing for troops and civilian audiences, earning BBC radio broadcasts and professional recording contracts. This was not merely an American phenomenon. Allied nations, despite different cultural traditions and social structures, had created space for women musicians to achieve professional success at levels that Japanese military bands, with their rigid hierarchies and gender restrictions, could not have accommodated. The implication was devastating. Flexible societies could mobilize talent more effectively than rigid ones. Pragmatism outperformed ideology. Systems that adapted to individual capability, even imperfectly and inconsistently, generated more collective capacity than systems that subordinated individual talent to fixed social categories. October brought a moment of personal reckoning that Yamamoto would remember for the rest of his life. A prisoner who had studied English before the war managed to arrange a brief conversation with one of the base musicians, a sergeant who played saxophone in various visiting ensembles. Through halting translation, Yamamoto asked the question that had been growing in his mind for weeks. Why did American audiences respect these women bandleaders? The sergeant looked confused by the question itself, as if Yamamoto had asked why water was wet. "They're good musicians," he said simply. "Why wouldn't we respect them?" The absence of complexity in his answer was the answer. For this soldier, the equation was straightforward. Skill earned respect, professional capability commanded attention, artistic excellence transcended social categories. The elaborate philosophical justifications Japanese culture required for any deviation from rigid gender norms simply did not exist in his framework. If you could play, you played. If you could lead, you led. The system was not perfectly meritocratic. The sergeant acknowledged that women faced obstacles, but capability created opportunities that social restrictions could not entirely suppress. This conversation forced Yamamoto to confront an uncomfortable truth. His empire had lost not merely militarily but philosophically. The war had not been decided only by industrial capacity or strategic geography or technological advantage, though all those factors mattered immensely. It had been decided by systems-level thinking, by societies capable of mobilizing total populations more effectively than rigid hierarchies allowed. When America needed entertainment for millions of troops, it deployed whoever could deliver: women, racial minorities, immigrants, anyone whose capability met requirements. The military did not waste time enforcing elaborate social restrictions that reduced available talent. It optimized for function. Japan, by contrast, had maintained rigid hierarchies even when they degraded operational effectiveness, had refused to mobilize women except in the most limited auxiliary roles, had insisted on purity of cultural form even when flexibility would have generated better outcomes. The result was visible in every measure: industrial production, resource distribution, technological innovation, strategic adaptation. Rigid systems shattered against pragmatic ones, but acknowledging this meant acknowledging that everything he had believed about Japanese cultural superiority was wrong. It meant accepting that the elaborate philosophical justifications for patriarchy and hierarchy were not eternal truths, but cultural choices that carried operational costs. It meant recognizing that his education had been, in fundamental ways, propaganda designed to maintain systems that benefited some at the expense of collective capability. The women bandleaders were not peripheral curiosities. They were evidence of a different social logic, one his empire had refused to comprehend. November 1945. The camp began showing educational films as part of the re-education program, and one featured the International Sweethearts of Rhythm performing at a war bond rally. Yamamoto watched with several dozen other prisoners in a Quonset hut that smelled of disinfectant and uncertainty. The film was propaganda, certainly, designed to showcase American industrial might and cultural vitality, but propaganda worked by showing truth, edited for maximum impact. What the film showed was undeniable: an integrated band of 16 women performing for a crowd of thousands, playing complex arrangements with professional precision, receiving thunderous applause from an audience that included military officers, industrial workers, and government officials. The camera lingered on faces in the crowd: white soldiers standing beside black civilians, women war workers clapping enthusiastically, children watching with open admiration. The social fabric on display was not harmonious. Yamamoto had learned enough about American segregation to know the contradictions ran deep, but it was functional in ways that mattered for total war mobilization. After the film, a camp administrator offered to answer questions. One prisoner asked with genuine confusion whether this represented a temporary wartime change that would reverse once men returned from service. The administrator, a middle-aged captain who had clearly participated in these re-education sessions many times, shook his head. Some of these bands started in the 1930s, he explained. They'll keep playing after the war because audiences pay to hear them. That's how entertainment works here. If you're good enough and people buy tickets, you have a career. The economic explanation again. Not ideology, not philosophy, not elaborate theories about natural social order. Simply market logic. If you provided value, you received compensation. If audiences paid, you continued working. The system was not fair. The captain acknowledged that women musicians often earned less than male counterparts, faced booking discrimination, dealt with social pressure to conform to traditional roles. But the space existed, the opportunities were real, and capability could carve out professional room even within imperfect systems. A younger prisoner asked whether this meant America had achieved gender equality. The captain laughed without humor. Not even close, he said. But we don't let perfect be the enemy of useful. The military needs entertainment. These women provide it professionally. So we hire them, and soldiers are smart enough to recognize talent when they hear it. The pragmatism was almost insulting in its simplicity. No grand ideological claims, just functional logic applied to immediate needs. Yet this unpretentious pragmatism had helped mobilize a nation more completely than all of Japan's elaborate philosophical justifications for sacrifice and hierarchy. December brought unexpected news. Several prisoners with musical backgrounds would be allowed to attend a special Christmas concert featuring multiple bands cycling through the base for holiday entertainment. Yamamoto was included, both because administrators knew his background and because his behavior during captivity had been cooperative and thoughtful. The concert was held in the base's largest venue, decorated with pine boughs and paper chains, filled with soldiers whose faces reflected exhaustion and relief that the war had finally ended. The prisoners sat in a designated section under loose guard, not as threats but as guests whose presence served larger re-education purposes. The message was clear. Observe how a democratic society functions. See what you were fighting against. Understand what your empire misunderstood. The evening's program included 3 different ensembles, 2 led by men and 1 by a woman named Helen O'Connell, who fronted a swing orchestra that had been touring military installations for 2 years. Yamamoto listened with the acute attention of someone whose entire understanding of civilization was being reconstructed, note by note. What struck him most was not the technical capability. By now he had accepted that these women musicians could play at professional levels, but the casual integration into military culture. Between sets, O'Connell joked with the audience, made references to shared experiences, spoke with the easy confidence of someone addressing peers rather than seeking approval. Soldiers responded with laughter and applause that felt genuine, not performative. She told a story about performing in Alaska during a blizzard, about equipment failures and improvisation, about the ridiculous logistics of touring wartime America. The narrative was not about gender barriers or social progress. It was about working conditions, professional challenges, the ordinary difficulties of any touring musician during extraordinary times. This ordinariness proved more philosophically devastating than any explicit propaganda could have been. O'Connell was not presented as an exceptional woman transcending her gender. She was presented as a competent professional, doing her job well under difficult circumstances. The distinction mattered. Japanese propaganda about women emphasized either traditional domesticity or exceptional sacrifice in auxiliary roles. The framing always highlighted gender, always made femininity either the central obstacle being overcome or the qualification limiting participation. Here, gender was simply one attribute among many, less important than professional capability, artistic skill, and work ethic. The subtle shift in framing revealed how deeply Japanese thought had been constrained by categories that Americans treated as more fluid and less determinative, not because Americans were ideologically enlightened, but because pragmatic systems allowed more flexibility than rigid hierarchies. January 1946 brought the coldest winter Texas had seen in decades, and with it, preparation for prisoner repatriation. Yamamoto knew he would return to a Japan he no longer recognized, to a nation occupied by the forces that had demonstrated not merely military superiority, but social adaptability that imperial ideology had refused to acknowledge. He spent his final weeks at Camp Mexia trying to articulate, in letters to his family and in conversations with fellow prisoners, what he had learned from the music that had filtered through barbed wire for 17 months. The words felt inadequate. How do you explain that your understanding of gender, hierarchy, and civilization had been fundamentally wrong? How do you convey that the enemy you had dismissed as culturally inferior had mobilized human potential more effectively than your own supposedly superior culture? How do you admit that professional women musicians were not anomalies, but evidence of systemic differences that mattered for everything from industrial production to military effectiveness to post-war reconstruction? Some prisoners remained in denial, insisting that what they had witnessed was wartime propaganda or temporary aberration. Others embraced the cognitive dissonance with the fervor of converts, declaring that everything Japanese culture taught was wrong and that American methods were superior in all respects. Yamamoto found himself in a third category, those who recognized both the failures of Japanese militarism and the complexity of American society, who understood that the lesson was not to swap one set of rigid beliefs for another, but to question the foundations of certainty itself. The women bandleaders mattered not because they proved American cultural superiority, but because they revealed how much was possible when systems prioritized function over form, when pragmatism created space for capability regardless of social category, when economic logic undermined traditional hierarchies enough to allow talent to find opportunities. He thought about the international sweethearts of rhythm, that racially integrated orchestra touring the segregated South. The contradictions were impossible to resolve into coherent philosophy. America practiced racial segregation while allowing racial integration in specific contexts. It restricted women's opportunities while creating professional space for women musicians. It claimed to value freedom while maintaining systems of oppression. Yet somehow these contradictions did not paralyze the society. Americans lived with philosophical incoherence that would have shamed Japanese intellectuals, lived with it functionally and pragmatically, let different principles operate in different domains, and by doing so mobilized their population more effectively than cultures that insisted on ideological purity. The lesson was not that inconsistency was superior to consistency. The lesson was that rigid consistency could be more expensive than most ideologies admitted. February brought his final concert before repatriation, another Sunday afternoon, another military ensemble, this time featuring Peggy Gilbert's orchestra from Los Angeles. Gilbert was older than most of the women band leaders he had observed, a veteran who had been leading groups since the 1920s, whose career spanned decades of American cultural transformation. She played saxophone with the confidence of someone who had performed thousands of times for audiences, ranging from intimate clubs to major concert halls. Her arrangements showed influences from classical training and jazz innovation, blending traditions that Japanese musical education kept carefully separated. The performance was not remarkable by American standards, a competent professional ensemble delivering solid entertainment, but for Yamamoto, it represented a final confirmation of everything he had learned. This was not wartime exception. This was established culture. Gilbert had been doing this for 20 years, had outlasted most male bandleaders from her era, had built a sustainable career in a competitive market through skill and persistence and adaptability. After the concert, through the prisoner who spoke English, Yamamoto managed to send a brief message of appreciation to Gilbert through military channels. He did not expect a response. Why would a successful American musician care about the thoughts of a Japanese prisoner? But 3 days later, a reply came back. The note was brief, typed on Red Cross stationery, but it acknowledged his message and thanked him for his interest in music. She wrote, "Music is a language that crosses all barriers. I hope you'll continue playing when you return home. The world needs more musicians and fewer soldiers." The sentiment was simple, almost trite, but it carried weight precisely because it came from someone whose career embodied principles his empire had rejected. She did not write about gender barriers or social progress or cultural superiority. She wrote about music as universal human activity, about the possibility of cultural exchange even between former enemies, about hope for a world where artistic communication might replace military conflict. The note became one of his most treasured possessions, not because it said anything profound, but because it existed at all. That a professional American musician would take time to respond to an enemy prisoner, would treat his appreciation as worthy of acknowledgement, would extend basic human courtesy across the vast divide of war and defeat. This small gesture encapsulated everything the performances had taught him. Respect, based on shared humanity, rather than social hierarchy. Communication that transcended rigid categories. The possibility of connection that ideology insisted was impossible. March 1946. His final week at Camp Mexia. Yamamoto spent hours in the camp library, reading everything he could find about American music, women musicians, the jazz tradition that had emerged from African American communities and transformed global popular culture. He learned about the Harlem Renaissance, about the blues, about how marginalized communities had created artistic forms that eventually commanded international respect. He learned that American culture was not monolithic, but constantly contested, that social progress was never linear, that the freedoms he had observed coexisted with oppressions he had only begun to understand. The complexity was overwhelming. Japan had been defeated not by a society that had solved all problems, but by one comfortable operating with unresolved contradictions, by systems that allowed multiple competing principles to function simultaneously, by pragmatic tolerance of philosophical incoherence that rigid ideologies could not accommodate. One of the final articles he read featured an interview with a black woman musician discussing her experiences touring the South with an integrated band. She described Jim Crow laws, segregated venues, hotels that refused service, constant negotiation of social restrictions that made even successful careers exhausting. Yet she also described packed audiences, respect from fellow musicians regardless of race, the growing sense that change was possible even if not yet realized. Her perspective was neither celebratory nor despairing. It was clear-eyed assessment of difficult realities combined with determination to continue working professionally, despite obstacles. This combination, acknowledging systemic problems while still pursuing individual opportunity, represented a psychological flexibility that Japanese cultural training had discouraged. You were supposed to either accept the system completely or reject it completely. The idea of working within imperfect systems while pushing for improvement, of holding contradictory truths simultaneously, of progressing incrementally rather than awaiting perfect solutions, these were not skills imperial education cultivated. On his last evening at Camp Mexia, Yamamoto stood near the wire fence as music drifted from the base auditorium one final time. He did not know who was performing. It did not matter. What mattered was what the music represented. Capability deployed regardless of rigid social categories, talent creating opportunities despite systematic barriers, pragmatism enabling functions that ideology would have forbidden. He thought about returning to occupied Japan, about reconstruction, about what lessons defeated nations might learn from victorious ones. The music suggested that the most important lessons were not about specific policies or political systems, but about fundamental approaches to human potential, whether societies mobilized or restricted capability, whether they adapted or insisted on purity, whether they allowed pragmatism to challenge certainty. The transport ship left San Francisco in late March, carrying 1,500 repatriated prisoners across a Pacific that no longer felt like the vast moat protecting Japanese civilization from external contamination. Yamamoto stood on deck, watching the American coastline recede, understanding that he was returning to a nation that would need to reconstruct not merely buildings and infrastructure, but entire frameworks of thought. The occupation forces would bring democracy, would write new constitutions, would implement reforms designed to prevent future militarism. But the deeper transformation would require questioning assumptions embedded so deeply in culture that most people could not perceive them as choices rather than natural laws. Gender hierarchy, racial purity, social rigidity, the superiority of form over function. These were not eternal truths but historical developments that carried operational costs visible only in comparison with alternatives. He thought about the women band leaders, about Ina Ray Hutton and Ada Leonard and the international sweethearts of rhythm, about Peggy Gilbert's 20-year career, about Helen O'Connell's casual confidence addressing thousands of soldiers. They had not been warriors or revolutionaries. They had been working musicians, professionals pursuing careers, human beings exercising capabilities that his culture had declared impossible for their gender. Their existence proved nothing about whether women should lead orchestras. That question assumed the answer required philosophical justification, when it actually required only removing arbitrary obstacles and allowing capability to seek appropriate outlets. The real revelation was simpler and more devastating. Societies that removed unnecessary restrictions mobilized human potential more effectively than societies that maintained elaborate hierarchical systems regardless of operational cost. This was not about equality as moral principle. It was about efficiency as pragmatic reality. The ship cut through gray water toward a homeland that no longer existed in the form he had left. Japan would rebuild. It would adapt. It would learn lessons from defeat that victory had obscured. But the deepest lesson, the one that music had taught more effectively than any re-education lecture, was that certainty itself was dangerous, that the assumptions you never questioned were often the ones most urgently requiring examination. That strength came not from rigid adherence to traditional forms, but from pragmatic adaptation to complex realities. The women on those stages had not been arguing for social change. They had simply been playing music professionally, but their presence revealed that different arrangements were possible, that capability could find expression even in imperfect systems, that the future might organize human potential according to principles his empire had never imagined. Takeshi Yamamoto returned to Osaka in April 1946, to a city destroyed by firebombing, to a nation occupied and transformed, to a family that had survived by luck and improvisation. He never conducted a military band again. There were no military bands to conduct, but he rebuilt his musical career slowly, working in dance halls and radio orchestras, teaching students who would help create post-war Japanese popular music. He spoke rarely about his time at Camp Mexia, about the women band leaders, about the concerts that had taught him more than any formal re-education program. When he did speak, usually to students who asked about his experience as a prisoner of war, he emphasized not the facts, but the epistemological lesson, that understanding other cultures required suspending certainty, that strength meant acknowledging error, that defeat could teach more than victory if you remained willing to learn. In the decades that followed, Japan would develop its own women musicians, its own jazz traditions, its own complicated relationship with gender and professional opportunity. The transformation was neither linear nor complete. Traditional hierarchies persisted alongside new possibilities. Old assumptions coexisted with emerging freedoms, and the tension between form and function remained contested terrain. But something had changed at a level deeper than policy or law. The certainty was gone. The assumption that Japanese culture had discovered eternal truths about gender and hierarchy and civilization had been revealed as historical contingency, as choices that carried costs, as traditions that could be questioned without destroying everything valuable they contained. The women bandleaders themselves continued their careers in various ways. Some maintained successful orchestras into the 1950s and beyond. Others retired as cultural tastes shifted and economic conditions changed. Few became household names, their contributions often overlooked in historical narratives that emphasized male musicians and traditional social progress stories. But for those who had witnessed their performances during that specific historical moment, soldiers seeking entertainment, prisoners confronting defeat, administrators facilitating unlikely cultural exchanges, their presence had mattered in ways that transcended individual careers. They had embodied possibilities that rigid ideologies insisted were impossible. They had performed capabilities that propaganda declared incompatible with femininity. They had commanded respect through skill, rather than asking permission through ideology. And in doing so, they had revealed that human potential was always larger than any system of categorization, that civilization progressed not by perfecting hierarchies, but by removing obstacles to capability, that the sound of freedom was not a battle cry, but a sophisticated swing arrangement played with professional precision by people society had underestimated. The music played on. The lesson remained.